to make the argument that this is a good idea, because most people's intuition is that it's a terrible idea to relax the territorial integrity rules, the rigid border rules. So that's what the book is going at, saying, well, maybe that wouldn't be so dangerous after all, and in fact could be a good thing.
That's not the thrust of my interview, but I have to say personally, I completely agree with you. I remember that because I study independence movements, there's the English-speaking Cameroons in French-speaking Cameroon. Those people are getting shot, and they don't view themselves as having the same culture. Well, tough. They're all part of Cameroon, so nobody cares about them.
I'm no expert on that conflict, but I do know a little about it. It's a good example of this issue that the two parts, English and French-speaking parts of Cameroon, which were parts of separate colonies, their borders, the units are defined by the colonial experience, and late in the colonial process, those two areas are merged. It is a kind of plebiscite. There is a choice to do it, but it's a very constrained choice, we could argue, in the colonial context. And the point is, regardless of the reasons as to why it happened at the time, you do find a situation in which there is an area in which there is an elite Anglophone and elite Francophone parts of Cameroon. So the judicial system, administration are in those languages. It's worth noting, of course, the majority of people are speaking languages that are neither of those, but these are the languages of government, administration, right, and they turn out to matter. And yes, recently it is moved to a very violent phase with English language Anglophone autonomists demanding rights, which I think they are accurate to say were supposed to be part of the binational, bilingual rather, state in the first place, but it's always been dominated by Francophones. And it's moved to a point where they've demanded more. The state has resisted, and a cycle of violence has developed. I'm not qualified to discuss who was the one who first moved to violence or where we ought to blame. But my point is more general. It is, as you suggested, it is a function of the fact that these two communities with different linguistic orientations are in the same state and, in a sense, struggling for position and dominance within it. That's an example of a place where existing borders are actually accelerating violence rather than, or rather the rigidity of borders is preventing us from seeing a fairly plausible alternative, which would be to think about why might the Anglophone sections want to separate from Cameroon. But the default in our politics today is that this is a terrible idea. Of course, we should be suspicious of secession and therefore defaulting to the interests or perspectives of the majority in the state.
Right, which means that from what I've seen, and I'm not an expert, but I see the videos I've seen, and maybe they were blah, 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 but I saw people speaking in English, peacefully protesting and getting shot. And the international community says, well, that's an internal issue. Those are the boundaries of that country. The majority government said X, and I go, but the majority government doesn't even like these people that it's supposed to govern, just like Saddam Hussein and the Kurds, just like the Tuareg, I think, in Chad. You have these ethnic groups, and someone said, you're part of this country. Yeah, but my ethnic group goes into these two other countries. Tough. Someone said 1920s, 1930s, live with it. And the Tuareg were involved in a ISIS overthrow of the government, not because they were extremists, but because they wanted their own country. And ISIS saw the opportunity.
In Mali, it's true that Tuareg and ISIS forces end up in an alliance. And this is, so rather than getting to the weeds of that case, I think it brings us to an important point. There's no doubt there are many groups that are seeking independence or greater autonomy inside their state that have very unpleasant agendas. And the very fact that some of them are ethnically oriented, I think, legitimately makes many people uncomfortable. So at least we have a notion that states in the modern system are not or should not be oriented around race and ethnicity. And for that reason, many actors are suspicious of separatists who often are very expressly focused on issues of ethnic or racial identity. I think this is, however, missing an important part of the point, which is that many states today are also ethnicized or national in orientation. It's simply that their nationality, their ethnicity is prioritized in the state. I always use the example of Germany. So there's a time in the past when, of course, Germany has a horrible racist government. Precisely because of that history, Germany today is actually an extremely decent, rights-respecting country.
Right.
One of the most decent countries in the world. It is also a highly, shall we say, nationally inflected society. By which I mean, if you want to succeed in business, get ahead in government, be elected to office, you need to be a German speaker, right? You need to do things in German ways. You should be on time to meetings, all sorts of stereotypes and so forth. It's a very German place, but not because it is necessarily or essentially for Germans as such. It's mostly a function of demography. It's a country with the borders it has and 80 million people, almost all of whom are German speakers and culturally German. So even if you were to absolutely strip any form of cultural preference from the formal laws, you'd still end up with a German-inflected society, and then that's fine. You'd be doing it on democratic grounds. Less pleasing for those who aren't German or whatever that have to assimilate to it. But the point, in other words, is there are many societies in the world today, many countries, in which the notion that they are not based on an ethnicity or a race or a linguistic or a religious category is partly a fiction. It's in a sense been assimilated to the state itself. And so for that reason, I think we should be less suspicious of groups that are in effect saying, we also want that. So they look as separatists, they look like they're ethnically oriented, but as long as they can demonstrate the same level of decency, respect for rights of others and so forth, it is quite reasonable to imagine what they're really asking for is not to be ethnic and oppress others, but simply to be a state like any others. Catalonia is a good example of this. The Catalans are often criticized by their opponents as being ethno-national, but with due respect, what do we understand the Spanish state as being? Although it has many groups within it, the Spanish nationalists are also being exclusivist in their way. I've met many Catalan nationalists. Some of them, indeed, I think, have a level of ethno-national sentiment that I find regrettable. But most of them, it seems to me, are very clearly simply desiring to have the kind of state like all the others in Europe in which their folkways, their language is demographically dominant. And I don't think there's anything illegitimate about that, because it's the same thing that is today true in Spain or France or Germany or many other places. In other words, it's not true that these groups are somehow uniquely or specially oriented towards ethnicity and race. It's an unfair thing to say about them. It's true that there are some groups that are like that, but again, that's also true of some existing countries, and we don't make the same kinds of critiques. So it's something important, I think, that I want to argue about in the book, is that we have many assumptions about what separatist groups, secession groups are like, what they will do, and much of the book is about criticizing those assumptions, showing that they are in fact quite questionable, often either untested or open to real doubt. And that's one that's an example, that the sort of automatic assumption that secessionists are somehow less or more illiberal or more likely to be ethno-national than existing states, I think actually is not a defensible argument.
I would certainly agree with the case of Scotland. So if you look at Scotland and their promotional videos, I've studied them closely. They have Arab women with the headscarf and on video go, I'm Scottish, right? And that was perfect. Like, it's clearly an immigrant woman, but she has a thick Scottish accent. And so the Scots were saying, if you're here, you're a Scot. That's how we view it. So be Muslim, be Christian, you're a Scot.
The United Kingdom as a whole, in most respects, is a very decent society. Obviously, they have their issues with class and race as anywhere else, but on a global scale, a truly wonderful, decent society. And the same can be said of Scotland. And yes, we can see there that the idea that the Scottish independence movement was somehow an illiberal, ethno-national fantasy, people painting themselves blue and crying freedom or something, depicts is ludicrous, right? It's clearly a decent movement that has a claim that we'd like to take on the